This talk is entitled Current Issues in Railway Aerodynamics. It's a version of the talk I gave at the Institute of Mechanical Engineers Road Vehicle Aerodynamics Conference in December 2020. The drivers of train aerodynamics are really rather different from the drivers of road vehicle aerodynamics. They're basically regulatory and safety rather than energy consumption, although that does figure. And there's another important point, is that the aerodynamic issues affect the infrastructure as much as the trains themselves. That being said, what I want to present in the following slides are, first of all, the methods that are used in train aerodynamics. Then I want to discuss the requirements for high-speed rail in aerodynamic terms, then talk a little bit about freight train aerodynamics, then about train and station pollutants and ventilation. And finally, I want to touch on the subject of platoons, which you'll see is something of a crossover issue between road and rail vehicle aerodynamics. So first of all, methods. In railway vehicle aerodynamics, we have the same sorts of methods as in other areas of aerodynamics. On the top left there, you can see a large moving model rig that can fire 25th scale trains along a 200-meter long test track. And moving model rigs are becoming really the tool of choice now in physical modeling in railway aerodynamics because they correctly model the relative motion between the train and the ground. We also, of course, use computational fluid dynamics. Full-scale testing is quite important, as you can see there. And also, a lot of material is now incorporated into a series of British Standard codes of practice, SEN codes, which pull together a lot of research over recent years. So what are the requirements then for high-speed rail? And these are quite varied. The first of these is to do with pressure transients. When trains go by, the nose of the train, as shown on the top right, creates a sizable pressure transient. And that can, those pressure transients are codified for European conditions, and there are certain requirements that must be met. And you can get these from full-scale measurements and CFD. And these, of course, can load both trackside structures and indeed trains quite heavily. And you can see there's some CFD work. Not complicated CFD required here. Ordinary RANs will be perfectly adequate for getting the nose pressure transients. And you can also use the moving model rig, as you see there, for measuring loads on things such as station canopies as trains go by. Largely, these loads are important, not in absolute terms, but in fatigue terms. They can load both train and infrastructure in a fatigue way. Train slipstreams, the airflow caused by trains, there are again code requirements for the maximum slipstreams velocities at trackside and on platforms to avoid the probability of an accident to passengers and trackside workers. Very unsteady flows as trains go by. The picture you can see on the top right there are the average slipstreams measured as an intercity express train goes by. And you can see that the peaks tend to be after the train has passed. And that's because of the trailing vortices that are shown in the CFD picture on the bottom right. The important thing, though, is that very unsteady flows that vary from train passage to train passage, and a statistical analysis of the results is required. Here, the methods tend to be either using full-scale testing or to some degree using model testing, such as moving model rig testing, freight train shown there rather than the passenger train. Another issue is that of ballast flight. At very high speeds, ballast is lifted off the track or can be lifted off the track and can cause a variety of problems which manifest themselves rather differently in different countries. It can be catastrophic damage, such as effectively paint stripping the entire underside of a train. It can be dislodging snow and ice. It can be causing ballast to sit on the rails and become crushed, causing track and wheel pitting. And the latter is really what tends to happen in the United Kingdom. This work is very much at a research stage and only in the early stages of codification and regulatory development. So full-scale experiments are carried out on trackside. We can see there Raker pitot probes. We can see a piece of instrumented ballast there. That's operated by the University of Southampton. And we can also see the work that we do on the moving model rig using an upside down train that actually gives us better access to the underside of the train that we need for this sort of work. There are, of course, other ways of doing under vehicle inspection, and here this is perhaps one of the more interesting. The codification of pressures in tunnels caused by the passage of trains obviously has a long history. In this country and in many other countries where railways developed early, tunnels are quite narrow and pressure transients passing up and down the tunnel can be quite significant and can cause significant oral discomfort. And indeed, for some passengers with particularly sensitive hearing, can be a source of some danger. There are code limits for pressure transients, and these can be measured either through moving model tests, through CFD analysis, or actually to a very large degree through very simple one-dimensional gas dynamics programs. Another interesting aspect of tunnel aerodynamics is the occurrence of sonic booms. It was found in Japan that as train speeds increase, particularly in rather narrow tunnels, the pressure waves in the tunnel would steepen and would be emitted from the far end of the tunnel at the frequency range of sonic booms. The Japanese got around this by retrofitting tunnel hoods of the sort we see at the top right there that allows an expansion of the tunnel at the inlet of the tunnel so that the pressure wave becomes less steep. A more modern version of that can be seen on the bottom right, where that shows some experiments carried out to try to develop a tunnel portal for HS2. Another way of getting around this is to lengthen the nose of trains so that the pressure wave caused as the train goes into the tunnel is smoothed out. Crosswind stability is another issue that we have. There's a history of trains blowing over in high winds, and we need to know how the risk of an accident can be determined. We see on the right a video taken outside the window of a train as it actually blew over. And you can see the results there. As I say, this has happened in a number of countries around the world recently. And oddly, a particular train at risk are the Channel Tunnel shuttle vehicles, which are very tall and at risk of overturning within the ports, and they are protected quite extensively by wind fences. So how can we determine the risk of a wind-induced accident? It's quite complicated. You need to know something about the wind characteristics, something about the aerodynamic characteristics, and you need to put those together into the vehicle wind system, some sort of mechanical model, and to calculate what's called a crosswind characteristic. Crosswind characteristic is a plot of train speed against accident wind speed. And then you can use that for a route risk analysis or for vehicle acceptance purposes. Aerodynamic characteristics come from wind tunnel tests or CFD, as one might expect. This sort of work has been carried out recently by Arab for HS2 in the very early preliminary design stages of a wind risk assessment model for HS2 that have identified potentially higher risk sites on the southern stretch of HS2. This is very much work that is still ongoing. So having given you a quick rundown of high-speed rail aerodynamic requirements, let's come on to freight train aerodynamics now. Freight trains move at a much lower speed than passenger trains, but it's becoming apparent that aerodynamic effects for freight trains are as significant. Crosswind effects. Containers have been known recently to blow off freight trains, largely because they weren't fastened on properly. And again, one can obtain the necessary aerodynamic information from CFD or from wind tunnel tests. Freight train slipstreams are actually of some significance. The bottom left-hand figure shows the passenger train slipstreams I've already talked about, with a peak and a wake. Freight train slipstreams, as on the top left, are really rather different, as they show a high level of slipstream velocity along the length of the train because of the growth of the boundary layer along the train. And this can have significant effects. In 2017, there was an incident at Twyford where a mother with a teenage disabled daughter in a wheelchair was on the platform with the wheelchair braked but not held as a freight train went by. As the freight train went by, the wheelchair was moved by the boundary layer on the freight train and sucked in towards the train. The girl in the wheelchair then hit the train mercifully at the side of a carriage and bounced off. She hurt her ankle. She was a very, very lucky young lady. RSSB have actually produced a safety video on this that illustrates a similar issue that took place at Nuneaton railway station. And here you can see the platform, and a freight train is coming through at some speed. And as the freight train comes through, you can see there a mother with a pushchair holding the baby. The pushchair is empty. And the boundary layer develops on the freight train until by about here, the boundary layer more or less envelops the whole platform. And you can see it starts the pushchair moving and draws the pushchair towards the train where it hits it. And mercifully, as I say, the baby wasn't actually there, but you can see the danger that freight train slipstreams can cause. Freight train drag is becoming of some importance. There's a move to increase the speed of freight trains because increasing the speed of freight trains would help with the overall capacity of the rail network. Freight train drag therefore needs to be known. This is usually measured by full-scale tests using coasting tests on the tracks such as we see there between Northallerton and Thirsk in Yorkshire. And a plot of acceleration against velocity is then derived, and you then fit a quadratic curve to it from which you can obtain aerodynamic information, including the drag coefficient. On to the third of my topics then, train and station pollutants and ventilation. Now this is of course only partly an aerodynamic issue, but we'll see is quite an important one. I became involved in this in some work that my colleagues did at the University of Birmingham on Birmingham New Street Station. It was a very dark underground station up to 2014 when it was redeveloped. The redevelopment, we took the opportunity to make lots of both station-wide fairly simple pollutant measurements using the device known as diffusion tubes in the top right, and more sophisticated pollutant measurements at some points along the station platforms. This was with a cooperation of Network Rail to help them develop their new ventilation system. And we measured some quite worrying results. We measured NO2, nitrogen dioxide, and PM2.5 particulates, and PM10. This shows daily averages across the measurement period. And you can see there the daily averages of NO2 at the top, and the hourly average set out in the EU codes of 200 micrograms per meter cubed that's not meant to be exceeded more than 18 times in a year. And you can see the red line, and you can see that it's exceeded a very great deal more than 18 times, even in our short 3-month measuring period. For PM2.5 and PM10, they're only annual averages that mustn't be exceeded, but again, you can see significant exceedances there. Some interesting points from the curve. Low values are shown there, and that matches with the Christmas break in 2016 when there were very few trains. Another set of low values later in January in 2017 that was the result of very high winds blowing pollutants through the station. And the highest values were measured rather irritatingly, just as we were taking down the equipment, in a very, very stable period of atmospheric wind, very little wind, and that allowed a buildup of pollutants. So atmospheric wind is quite important. Short-term averages, here we show a day of data, and we plot the same NOx concentration on the three figures, and we indicate when trains of different sorts are in the platform. On the top line, we can see when turbostars, a multiple unit, were in the station, and you can see in the morning, then we can actually see a peak corresponding to turbostars close to the measuring point. Excuse me, and we can also see in the second figure when Voyager trains were in the station, and again we can perhaps early in the morning see some correlation. HST 125 trains, very little correlation with pollutant levels, and it seems that although we can pick out correlations in the morning, later on in the day, train movement mixes up the pollution together with the station ventilation system and basically causes high levels across the station. But these high levels are particularly associated with the emissions from a small number of trains. These results were used by Network Rail to help develop their ventilation system, and the situation is much better now. A comparison study was funded by RSSB, and King's College London and Edinburgh University made measurements at King's Cross Station and Edinburgh Waverley and compared these with Birmingham New Street. So NO2 on the left, particulates on the right. We have King's Cross at the top, Edinburgh Waverley in the middle, and Birmingham New Street at the bottom. And you can see the red line showing the EU limits. King's Cross and Waverley still exceed those limits, but not as badly as New Street. But that's not the whole story. In recent press coverage, the BBC have reported on high levels of particulates, very high levels of particulates within trains on the tube. And also, one of their reporters travelled, I think, from Bedford down to London and measured the levels of particulate pollutants on different modes of train. And there again, he found very high levels of particulates within trains, within diesel trains in particular, and not so much within electric trains. A more refined academic study was carried out in Canada, and again they found, bottom left there, and again they found fine particles and black carbon, very high levels on trains. This was matched by some work more recently in Greece, where they measured a lot of pollutants on multiple unit diesel trains, and in particular found high levels of NOx that again massively exceeded the EU limits. And this is because essentially these trains are ingesting through their air conditioning system the diesel emissions from their own exhaust and from the exhaust of other trains, and are particulates from the rather dirty railway environment. So there's a driver to reduce on-train pollutants by minimizing air exchange with the outside. Now, when we come to the recent pandemic and to COVID, and here is a publicity poster from SNCF in France, there is obviously a driver to provide very extensive ventilation with clean air from the outside, replacing the air within the carriage, potentially with pathogens, very regularly. There's a dichotomy here. One situation requires less air from the outside, one requires more. There's lots of work to be done on this. All I will say is that I think we're going to see a lot more work of this sort over coming years. So then, brings me to my last topic very briefly, and that's the topic of platoons. Road vehicle platoons, such as we see at the top there, are being trialled in the UK. In aerodynamic terms, they're very, very similar to railway freight trains. And we've made measurements on both on the moving model rig at Birmingham. So they're very similar. The main concern, of course, is with how drag is reduced, and we can measure that both in moving model test and with CFD. But interestingly, on lorries, we've also found significant lateral oscillations when lorries operate in platoons. And watch this space. I hope these will be reported in due course. So what are the takeaways from this talk? We all have takeaways these days, don't we? We used to have conclusions, we now have takeaways. So there are some takeaways, my favorites. But from this talk, the takeaways are that aerodynamic concerns of road and rail vehicles are very different. And for railway vehicles relate as much to the infrastructure as to the vehicle. The range of issues in train aerodynamics is very diverse indeed, as I think you'll have seen. I believe train ventilation and air quality is likely to become a major field of study with a significant aerodynamic input. And there's a point of convergence of road and rail vehicle aerodynamics in ongoing work on platoon studies that I think may be of considerable interest to both the road and rail vehicle aerodynamic community. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.